Welcome to the Macmillan Report. I'm Marilyn Wilkes, your host, and our guest is Catherine Panterbrick, a professor of anthropology, health, and global affairs at Yale University. Professor Panterbrick's research consists of critical analyses of health and well-being across key stages of human development, giving special attention to the impact of poverty, disease, malnutrition, armed conflict, and social marginalization. Her focus on children in global adversity has included biocultural research with street children, refugees, and war-affected adolescents. She has published widely on child and adolescent health, including articles on conflict and mental health in Afghanistan, infant survival in famine-stricken Niger, growth retardation in Nepali slums, biomarkers of stress in the context of violence and homelessness, and the effectiveness of public health and humanitarian interventions. Today we'll talk with Professor Panterbrick about the research she's done in Afghanistan, focusing on the mental health of children. Welcome, Professor Panterbrick.
Thank you, Marilyn.
Let's begin with an overview of your research. Tell us about it.
We conducted the first large-scale mental health survey in Afghanistan, and before that there was simply no data to speak of that was systematic. So to put the research into context, there's about 1 billion children who live in conflict-affected countries, and in 2009 there were 36 armed conflicts, 6 of which escalated to the intensity of war, including Afghanistan. So conflict and health is a very big problem. In terms of research, there's very little research that focuses on adolescents, which are the next generation, rather than adults, and very little research that looks at family context and community context rather than clinics, and also that takes a longitudinal look at how things evolve over time. So we did a study of 1,600 children and 1,600 parents and teachers. We looked at this in the community setting, and we did a longitudinal work. So that was quite a landmark study.
And what was the impetus for the study? Why did you do it?
It was the product of working for about 10 years on children in global adversity, so homeless children, war-affected children, refugee children, and I often found there was a disconnect between the health interventions we put in place and the everyday lives of children. So we wanted to really illustrate what matters in the lives of children, their needs now and their aspirations for the future. So to do that as an anthropologist, we really try to look at what children themselves have to say and what civilian populations have to say, because they're the least studied.
I see. Let's talk about your methodology. How did you do the research?
We worked in schools. It was quite evident that that was the really only setting that was possible to work in, because we wanted to interview face-to-face children in privacy, and we also had to ensure the safety of the field team. So working in mosques or homes would not be possible to do. The field team was 3 local women and 3 men who were interviewing going from school to school in a very politically and economically insecure environment. So our office was sprayed by gunfire during the 2006 riots.
Wow.
An NGO pulled out support in the rural area because the car of female interviewers came after dark. So those were kind of challenges, if you want, to work with. Establishing the random sample of school and contacting boys and girls and fathers and mothers was really the most difficult thing to do. We were unable to access children out of school, but there's about 68% of children nationally who have enrolled in school at the moment, so we're talking about a very large proportion of children and an ever-growing proportion of children.
I was going to ask you that, because I would have been under the impression that many children do not attend school, so 68% is much higher than I would have thought.
It's very fast-growing. Education is at the premium. Families know that. Those who can often put their children and struggle to keep them there. We're talking about 11 to 16-year-olds, so in the context of boys having to really work for the household economy and girls at the age of marriage, it's quite remarkable that those children still get to school. So because of curtailed education in the Taliban, some 16-year-olds are in primary classes, of course. So it's all a mixed match of ages.
And is it equal boys and girls, or are there more boys than girls? Or
there's obviously more boys than girls,
really?
about 3/4 of boys and a lesser proportion of girls, but they have girl and boys schools very often. Then the other point to make was really that when you're working in conflict settings, you're very often guided by a paradigm that mental health is consequent of trauma of war, and I wanted to broaden that agenda a little bit to think about risk in a more interdisciplinary way. So I was trying to marry the best of psychiatry with the best of social sciences. And in psychiatry you want to understand what mental health disorders are and who has them, so you can treat individuals. In the social sciences you might want to think about how this suffering comes about and why it's occurring and how it's experienced and coped with, so how it's articulated in a society setting.
And was it difficult to do the work in the schools? How were you received?
As I say, we worked through local partners, so we had a Ministry of Education letter which helps open doors. We worked through a social work professor in Peshawar and a psychiatrist in Kabul. I'm an anthropologist. My research partner Mark Eggerman is a Middle Eastern specialist. So we put together the kind of team that would be able to be very effective. We implemented it with a Kabul-based research agency called Altai, and it was funded by a medical charity. It was difficult. The most difficult thing was to get this random sampling of schools, because you had to have a list of schools which didn't exist at the national level, only district level, and a list of children which only existed at class level rather than at school level. So that was a challenge. But in itself, participation is not that difficult. The Afghans have a great tradition of hospitality, so when you get to talk to them, they invite you in. And we had, because we took our time and we built rapport, it was quite extraordinary, really. Children told us it was the first time that somebody had come to ask them what their difficulties were. Mothers told us it was the first time they had been allowed outside their home to visit the school and to meet the child's teacher. And the teachers told us it was the first time they'd been asked to reflect on how difficulties might interfere with education performance. So that was, participation, I say, was very high. People saw the value of that.
And you mentioned that your research is interdisciplinary. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
So it, as I said, we tried to approach it from bottom-up, the social sciences approach. So we included a survey that looked at mental health disorders and what they were, with interview approaches that would understand us the how and the why of suffering as it existed. One of the things we found was that the most powerful predictor of poor mental health was violence, and that you can find out through a survey. But the explanation for that violence is only realized through the interview. And what was interesting was that the violence was not just contingent on war. It was not just a spectacular form of military violence that mattered to the life of children. It was very much the violence experienced through accidents and no resulting health care, or beatings in the home, or stabbings and brutality in the neighborhood. So the message is really not to just get drawn into the visible forms of violence that we expect: bombardments, explosion, the American war, landmine injury, but also the more invisible forms of violence that exist and affect children very deeply, what we call everyday violence.
Okay, so that was one of your findings. Were there any others?
The findings in terms of prevalence was that 1 out of 5 children suffered from mental health disorders in the clinical range. That's twice what you expect in that age group, so it tells you that mental health is a big issue in Afghanistan. The more interesting finding might be that you could turn it around and say 4 out of 5 children live in that toxic milieu of poverty and violence, and yet show few of the symptoms in the clinical range. So those are you could call them the resilient children. Risk and resilience is like two faces of a coin. You have the vulnerability and the survivors. We tend to think of children as victims of war, but also surviving it. So that proportion is showing you that, yes, you can focus on the 1 out of 5, but it's very deeply interesting to understand how the 4 out of 5 managed to survive war in those circumstances and come out with better outcomes that you might expect.
Let's talk about the mental health issues themselves. What are some of the mental health problems that you saw?
Well, most often you find in that age group boys would have conduct disorders. at schools, and girls would have emotional disorders of depression. And in Afghanistan, it's very much all of them depression, internalizing disorders. So a great deal of sorrow, a great deal of grief, and what we simply call depression, what I call the loss of hope in the future. So there's grief related to war and the loss of your beloved and your relatives. If you lose your father, for instance, you're in an incredible precarious position because your father is the person who might get you your preferred cross-cousin in a marriage, for instance, or you become you fall at the mercy of an uncle. So losing your father or losing your mother is really a huge loss of social support. And so when that happens, you are in a vulnerable position in society. You don't have somebody to fight your corner, if you speak. So there's that. I would say that's the most important, the depressive symptoms, the most important mental health problems that we found.
Did a majority of the children you spoke to, did the majority of them have loss in their lives?
Yeah, everybody. I think the scale of loss is enormous. I mean, you have people having 30 relatives killed in the war.
My goodness.
And the war has been going on for 3 decades. So it cascades from one generation to the next. So that's pretty much everybody that is affected. And yeah.
Are you doing a follow-up survey to the
We
study?
did a follow-up survey, which was pretty interesting in the sense that in the absence of an intervention, mental health outcomes were better a year later, and that was a real surprise. I was expecting them to go downhill. And I understand those findings by the fact that I could only follow up those who had stayed in school, and due to the absence of record keeping, we couldn't follow those who had left school, so we lost about 40% of the sample in Kabul. And it is those families that were able to anchor their children at school. That's a measure of strength and resilience despite debt, despite illness, despite the threat of being evicted. Some families live in tents in the middle of a communal courtyard with no heating and no electricity.
My goodness.
That's the precariousness of the housing that you find, or the families are 3 families to a room. Despite that, they were able to keep their children at school. And so it's not surprising that their mental health outcomes didn't necessarily deteriorate. Those that did, within that sample, talked of family harmony and unity being difficult. So the diary phrase is itifaq and wahdad, meaning the family had conflict. There was severe beatings inside the house. There was all the time some kind of frustration that erupted, and that made life very difficult. So it says that family violence is really an enduring predictor of children's mental health, even in the context of that extraordinary military violence that's going on in the larger picture.
So they kind of have a double whammy, the violence of the war and then the violence at home.
Yeah, I think of several layers.
Yeah.
So there's the most spectacular one and the most invisible one, and I think you need to address both. And I think you need to really understand how difficult it is to struggle in that context. I mean, a professor at Kabul at that time makes $50 a day. That's not enough to pay the rent in the context of these huge rent rises because of the expatriates' presence. So it really is a struggle, and that the 2 kinds of violence are linked, because your frustrations from the structural kind of violence that's exterior kind of implodes inside the house.
And causes additional trouble.
And the health of the mental health of the caregiver and the child was very closely related. That tells you that you need to intervene at family level rather than just individual level.
Okay, so based on your findings, what are your recommendations for improving children's mental health?
The recommendations in humanitarian settings is quite clear. It is to provide psychosocial intervention, psychotherapy to children who have post-traumatic stress disorder type of distress that's consequent on trauma. And that's the tip of the iceberg, and that's looking after psychological well-being. For the rest, my mental health intervention would be a structural intervention. It would be to address the social, economic and political barriers that make children's life a misery. So I remember an Afghan father telling me that the broken economy is at the root of all the man's misery. And I remember that phrase because to me it would be, the first thing would be to repair the broken economy, to fix the overcrowding and provide adequate housing for these families so that children might have electricity at night so that they can study after school and not have, and on top of their carpet weaving before and after school to help the family. Pay the teachers a very decent wage because some of them have 2 jobs. They clock into school, go and get a second job, clock back into school, because you need 2 jobs to keep your family going. And so in that context, the economy is really something that you have to fix first and foremost. So I think working across sectors would be a very useful thing to do, and not narrowly think of the risk to mental health as being just war and just a mental health intervention.
And based on your recommendations, do you think that they have any possibility of being implemented?
Yes, there's a basic package of health services in Afghanistan, and it's very unusual. I think Cambodia is another country where mental health is selected as one of the basic components for all health services. So that's a very big progress in that way, and that signals that mental health is a huge issue. And so there is work to do to structurally make it happen so that mental health is not a psychiatric tertiary care, but seen at the primary level and working across sectors. But that will take some time. But I think we're rowing in the right direction.
Wonderful. And what was the greatest surprise to you in doing the study?
The greatest surprise was the expression of determined hope that children had, which I didn't expect. I was expecting to see distress, but not really this incredible determination to get to where they wanted to be, and this idealistic expression of their future. To give you an example, we asked the children to draw themselves in the present and in the future. And they drew themselves in the present with rags and in tears, and in the future as excellent doctors or remarkable engineers or dedicated teachers. And I remember one girl who was a street child and worked selling plastics in Kabul after and before school. And she drew herself in rags in the present, and then in the future she drew herself with a table and a microphone, and she said she was going to be the first female presenter at Radio Kabul, and a presenter like you, Marilyn. That's what she wanted to do.
Oh.
And you could say, you know, she'll never get there, but that's the wrong attitude. The right attitude to say that she had the hope, and that gave meaning to her life, and that was that aspiration is very important to the future. So I think in mental health, for instance, Westerners think of, we tend to think about explaining present well-being in terms of the past, and especially looking at the impact of war on present-day psychological health. Afghans articulate the impact of the future for their present health. So it's where they're going to go that that makes meaning to their everyday suffering. And a girl who has that kind of determination and hope is a girl who is in better psychological health than somebody who's lost all hope. And hope is what keeps you going. It keeps a man standing up, and it's your anchor of resilience in the midst of great suffering.
And it is surprising that there is so much hope still there.
It is surprising so much hope, that it's very important to follow through. You're building schools and inviting refugees to come home in Afghanistan, so you have to have the follow-through to provide socioeconomic opportunities. Otherwise, you're turning a very hopeful generation into angry, frustrated men and bitter people. And so that's very important, and that's an ethic of hope, if you want, in terms of reconstruction with the massive funds going in the country. But I remember one woman, and she said it very simply in 4 little words. She said, "Life feeds on hope." That's a very beautiful phrase.
It is.
So my take-home message for global mental health might be 2 things. It might be, first of all, work at the family level to strengthen families and really connect very deeply with the everyday life of children and their parents, and work across sectors, mental health, social and economic sectors. And the second would be not just to alleviate suffering, but to build on that hope and the aspiration, which is so important in the lives of kids.
Hopefully those things will happen in Afghanistan. Thank you very much for being here with us today and sharing some of your work.
Thank you, Marilyn.
For more information about Professor Panterbrick and her work, please visit our website at yale.edu/Macmillan Report. Be sure to join us again for another episode of the Macmillan Report, made possible through funding from the Whitney and Betty Macmillan Center for International and Area Studies at Yale.